you very much.
Order. Could I thank all those members who've taken part in that important debate and ask if they're not staying for broadband in Cheltenham, if they would be kind enough to leave the chamber quickly and quietly, no doubt with plenty to chew over as they leave. Because we now move on to the important subject of broadband in Cheltenham, in the name of Mr. Martin Horwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, you have to forgive me just taking a moment to catch my breath. And so after a 3-hour journey, I've just had to run across New Palace Yard in order to get into the chamber on time. But we're here. The origins of the problems in Cheltenham actually date back quite a long time. We have an unusual layout of telephone exchanges in the town, in that we have one single telephone exchange which serves a town of 120,000 people. That is quite an unusual layout. It means that the further you get from that central exchange by copper wire, then the worse your service is, your telephone service is. Now, in the 1960s, as that telephone exchange developed, that didn't make a massive difference. It meant you had slightly worse voice call quality further out in the outlying areas of town. Today, it makes a huge difference because, of course, internet broadband speeds also drop off the further you get from that exchange, which means that even if some parts of the town had the decent basic broadband service of about 2 megabits per second, as you got to outlying areas like Hatherley and Springbank, you hit speeds as low as 0.5 megabit per second. Now, this is something that I've raised over many years, and I raised with ministers' predecessors, even the previous government. But we were told that the digital revolution was coming, and we need have no fear, because between the commercial rollout and what the government has quite rightly prioritised as a, if you like, a gap-filling exercise, the BDUK programme to subsidise hard-to-reach areas, that all would be well. And indeed, the government has put more than £100 million into BDUK for England in order to try and reach those areas that weren't commercially viable. BT told us that, again, they were overwhelmingly going to be able to supply most parts of Cheltenham with a commercial service, and that other operators would also be playing that part. So it looked as though the government's targets, which are very ambitious, would certainly be met as far as Cheltenham was concerned. The government's target is, of course, to achieve 90% availability of superfast broadband with speeds as high as 25, 30 or more megabits per second, but that everybody should have that basic 2 megabits per second broadband service, whether they'd upgraded to superfast fibre optic or not. Now, it looks to me as though there's a real risk that neither of those targets are going to be met with respect to Cheltenham, and I would suggest that actually if they're not going to be met in an urban area like Cheltenham, that they are unlikely to be met nationwide. And this does really matter in this day and age, because we're not just talking about something that's used for entertainment or for casual purposes. You're talking about people who work from home having to access documents. I had one computer programmer talking to me about taking 3 days to download a program using the broadband speeds that are available to him. You have children trying to access their homework. My own kids access intranets from their school in order to actually file their homework and access homework materials. People bank by the internet. People respond to any number of government consultations using the internet these days. People apply for university using the internet. So this kind of basic internet service is no longer a luxury. It is something that people expect. And it's something that they certainly expect when they buy new houses. And so when you have people moving into an almost brand new estate and discovering that they don't even have 2 megabits per second as the available broadband service, then that is clearly quite unacceptable, and we need to ask some questions about why that is happening. Now, the commercial rollout has proceeded, and BT have done a pretty good job. They have reached, they estimate, or they are reaching, something like 88% of the homes in Cheltenham. but that clearly leaves a gap of at least 1 in 10 of homes. Some other commercial operators, Virgin and others, are active in the town, and they are filling a little bit of that gap, but far from all of it. So you would hope that then the government subsidised programme would step in and be able to fill the remaining holes. But that doesn't seem to be happening. What the government-sponsored programme in Gloucestershire, which is called Fastershire, tell me, is that there are various technical reasons why they simply can't fill those gaps. They can't fill them because they did an open market review in 2011, which didn't identify those specific gaps. They were given information by the commercial suppliers on a postcode basis, whereas actually the supply is, of course, provided on a cabinet by cabinet or a street by street or an even premises by premises basis. And so this was an inaccurate picture of where broadband was going to be provided on a commercial basis. They also say that BT and some of the other commercial operators have changed the boundaries and the areas on which they're operating, but because the way Fastershire is set up, they have to apply for state aid exemption in order to subsidise particular postcode areas, and they can't then undo that approval in order to fill in gaps that emerge over time. And I hope the Minister's broadband service is good on his mobile phone that he's checking up on at the moment, because I hope this is actually sinking in terms of the seriousness of what's happening in Cheltenham. Good. And I think it is... Yes.
My honourable friend is inviting me to intervene. I'm happy to intervene and start responding to him now. I obviously am very aware of all the points that he's making, and I'm very pleased that he managed to make it to his own debate.
Yes, thank you. The problem that people face now is that they are falling between the gaps. Fastershire are providing a rollout programme which is overwhelmingly geared to the rural areas and which did not identify, even after the open market review had shown that there were gap areas in urban Cheltenham, has not identified a way of immediately delivering a decent broadband service or the access to superfast broadband in the areas that have been left out. And we're finding out about increasing numbers of these areas. They're in Benhall, they're in the Reddings, they're in Up Hatherley, they're in Springbank, they're in Battledown in Cheltenham, and only last week I discovered a new area in the St Paul's part of town where a brand new estate has been provided without decent broadband services. And it does seem to be that it's new estates or estates that are filled in between older areas that seem to be one of the key problems and where the service doesn't seem to have been provided. And this may be some kind of historical pattern. It may be that they didn't have their own dedicated BT cabinets, or that the BT cabinet served a smaller number of premises. But whatever the reason, people find it particularly extraordinary that they're moving into brand new homes where the developers haven't bothered to ensure that broadband services were provided, and then they find they are falling between the gaps where BT or other commercial operators tell them it's not commercially viable for them to have that service, and Fastershire say, sorry Gov, it's nothing to do with us, you're outside our approved area. Now, Fastershire are conducting a new open market review, but if some of these problems of communication between them and the commercial operators persist, if again we have the problem that the information is provided on a postcode basis, when actually services are provided by cabinet or by street or by individual premises, then we may find that yet again gaps emerge and that yet again households are left out. So there are a few things that I would like to ask the Minister to have a look at. One is around planning and building regulations. It seems to me quite wrong that if we are ambitious as a government to deliver superfast broadband on such an ambitious basis across the country, that we're allowing new estates to be built today without proper broadband services being provided. Now, that is something that could be tackled. I know councils are wary these days of imposing restrictions on developers, conditions on planning consents that might be seen to be unreasonable, that might be seen to threaten the commercial viability of a housing development. So they're not holding back from this, I don't think, without due reason in some cases. but I would like the Minister to talk to his colleagues in the Department for Communities and Local Government and see if we can reassure councils that it will be regarded as reasonable, that they will not be challenged if they insist that new developments that are now being developed, that the developers have to put in decent broadband services and connect, pay, if necessary, BT to connect their local cabinet to the option of superfast broadband. The second thing is for the Minister to go to, well, I guess at national level this would be BDUK and the various commercial providers, mainly BT, but also Virgin, EE, TalkTalk, Sky and others, and try and resolve these issues about communicating and the basis on which the maps are drawn, which decide what is commercially viable and what isn't. That seems to me something that it would be quite reasonable to knock some heads together and say, listen, it is completely unacceptable that you all have the information, but each side is blaming the other about the way in which that information is provided. Fastershire and Gloucestershire told me they were only provided with the information by BT and the others on postcode basis, so that was the only basis on which they could draw their maps. BT insists that Fastershire have all the information they need in order to fill the gaps, so they can't both be right. And I think the Minister needs to sit down with BDUK, with the commercial providers, and really knock heads together and find out why that urban areas like Cheltenham and presumably urban areas right across the country are having so many gaps left out of the rollout. And then I think we need to actually offer a bit of challenge to some of the commercial operators. We need to remove, at least behind closed doors, that cloak of commercial confidentiality and ask about exactly what basis they are using to judge whether or not an area is commercially viable. On some occasions, they have suggested to people that if they could raise the money themselves, that would effectively add the subsidy through just the community, then they would be able to be connected to superfast broadband or have the option of superfast broadband. But if a community is willing to raise that money in order to subsidise it, presumably they'd be willing to pay the premiums that are required to upgrade to superfast broadband, thereby implying that it would be a commercially viable proposition to go into that particular street or estate. And I'm still not clear whether or not BT is really judging whether the poor service that areas get at the moment is part of the consideration, or whether they're just doing it on a kind of tick box exercise with demographics and house prices and so on, and the topography of the area, because these decisions seem to be quite fine judgments in some cases. Now, there are a few bits of good news. There is the good news that both BT and Fastershire have been prepared to talk about these issues. Now, I think in both cases genuinely committed to removing the embarrassment of these gaps that are being left out of the programme. There are some good news stories where community effort has actually resolved the issue. And Cabinets 124 and 214 in Cheltenham are in different ways, both good news stories. In one case, the community persuaded developers of this new estate to underwrite the cost of putting superfast broadband into their local cabinet, and so that cabinet should be okay. In another case, they persuaded BT to shift the cabinet so that the viability of it seemed apparently to be more commercially promising, and therefore BT are including that in their rollout plans. But we still have a number of other cabinet areas that have been left out. We still have new streets being notified to me on a weekly basis where people are getting very poor services. And in some cases, going back to the original problems with the centralised exchange, it is particularly hard for them to take because those were some of the areas that were most distant from the old exchange and where the service is particularly bad. So in some parts of Cheltenham, you have people in one street with a service of 0.5 megabits per second, which is an unconscionably slow service, only yards away from people who can now get 25, 30 megabits per second and have a 60 times better service. And that is pretty hard for people to understand and pretty hard for people to accept. And so I think what I don't expect from the Minister is an instant solution to this. I realise there are complexities around state aid rules, around the planning of these programmes over many years. But what I would say to him is that I don't think we are likely to meet our ambition as a government of supplying at least 90% of the population with access to superfast broadband by next year, supplying everybody with a service of at least 2 megabits per second or better, if areas like Cheltenham are not meeting those kind of targets. So I would like him to at least promise to recognise the problem, to try and get the commercial providers and the rollout programme for BDUK, programmes like Fastershire and Gloucestershire together, to try and establish really what information can be shared on a rolling basis to make sure that these gaps don't emerge and continue to emerge in the delivery of broadband. Because I think the government has been quite right to prioritise this. The calculation is that superfast broadband could be worth £400 million to the Gloucestershire economy alone. To the country as a whole, it is vitally economically important. It is part of our future, it is part of our competitiveness as a 21st century nation, and we have to do better than we are doing for some of my constituents. Thank you very much, Mr.
Order. Could I commend the honourable gentleman for the way in which he's addressed the House this morning, and in particular for starting the debate by demonstrating what the human form of superfast broadband might look like. For one dreadful moment, some of us thought that he might be the replacement for the honourable member for Lewis in the Home Office, but I'm delighted he's managed to be here. And I think his constituents should know that he's made his whole speech without referring to any notes. And having listened to a lot of the honourable member's speeches, could I say that he speaks rather better without notes than he does with briefs supplied to him. Minister.
Well, Mr. Holloway, it's a pleasure to appear before you this morning with my prepared speech typed out for me by my officials, to which I intend to refer constantly through the next 15 minutes. May I also join you in congratulating the honourable member for his superfast appearance at this morning's debate at 10:59. I wondered whether he was going to make it, but he arrived right on cue. I have to say, though, Mr. Hollowbone, that his first initial remarks were characterised by a certain breathlessness. And for those of us who aspire to appear for our appearances in this House to be broadcast on Today in Parliament, I have some concerns that maybe the BBC will decide not to broadcast the beginnings of this debate in case they get complaints from their listeners about heavy breathing. I was worried enough about the honourable member at one point when he actually stopped dead in the middle of his speech, and I was forced to intervene to ensure that he had recovered appropriately. But the honourable member has covered a number of important points, both to do with his own constituency broadband issues as well as some national issues, and he has made the point very fairly throughout that this is a flagship programme for the government, and on a national level we are investing something like £1.7 billion in superfast broadband rollout. That is money direct from government as well as money from local authorities, some European money, forgive me for mentioning that, Mr. Hollowbone, as well as some private sector money from BT. And the honourable member highlighted examples in Cheltenham, and indeed many of the cases, many of the specific issues he raised are indeed the kind of issues that I have had to grapple with over the last 4.5 years. Let me begin, as the honourable member did refer to the national picture on several occasions in his remarks, to remind the House about the successes we are now seeing in terms of the national broadband rollout. Coverage of superfast broadband in the UK is very high at 78%, and we outperform the other 4 big European economies, and indeed on the world stage we perform very well, both in terms of access to superfast speeds. And another important point I think to make, Mr. Hollowbone, when looking at access to broadband is the price. We have a very competitive telecoms market in the UK at very accessible prices. I'm often told that in such and such a country you can access speeds such as 100 megabits, but what nobody ever completes the sentence by saying, but that will cost you, say, the equivalent of 80, 90, 100 pounds a month, or maybe even more. So price is also very important. We've passed more than 1 million premises since all the contracts were signed. We're now passing something like 40,000 additional premises every week. The honourable member referred to the need for commercial providers to do more in urban areas. And I'm pleased that partly as a result of discussions with government, BT has set aside an additional £50 million for broadband in cities. And I'm also pleased that Virgin, under its new leadership, is also looking at extending its footprint, something it hadn't done before. So we expect, for example, something like 500,000 premises in cities and towns to be additional premises to benefit from the commercial deployments of BT and Virgin. And overall, thanks to our superfast broadband programme, something like 4 million additional premises will get coverage. Turning to the local issues raised by the Honourable Member, the Fastershire project covering Herefordshire and Gloucestershire will see central government investment of something like £29 million and total investment of over £55 million. The programme itself, covering both counties, and I appreciate this isn't the Honourable Member's specific constituency, but it has reached over 32,000 homes and businesses already and will reach almost 150,000 over the next 3 years. That will mean that Herefordshire and Gloucestershire will see 93% of their premises enjoying the benefits of superfast broadband. Indeed, Cheltenham itself, the Honourable Member's constituency, is projected to see coverage of some 96%. My understanding is that 48,000 out of 50,000 premises will be covered by commercial deployment, and of the 2,000 that aren't covered, some 625 should be covered by the phase 2 of our broadband project. Of course, I will give way to the Honourable Member.
I'm grateful to the Minister, and I'd be very interested to know where that figure of 96% comes from, because it's not something I'm familiar with. BT tell me they are delivering commercial broadband to 88% of the town. They can't tell me, and neither can Fastershire, how much of the remainder is being supplied by people like Virgin. So as it stands, at least 1 in 10 households in Cheltenham will not be included and will not have the advantage of that commercial rollout. So he doesn't have to provide this to me now, but if he could write to me and explain where that 96% number came from, I'd be extremely grateful.
Minister.
I will certainly set out the details to the Honourable Member. My understanding is obviously that where BT is only responsible for setting out what its own coverage will achieve in Cheltenham, but we are able to have an overview and therefore look at the coverage provided, for example, by other companies such as Virgin Media in terms of the total coverage provided in Cheltenham. And of course, thanks to local loop unbundling, residents in Cheltenham, like residents all over the country, are able to take advantage of other providers using the network such as Sky and Talk. The Honourable Member did mention the issues with state aid, and it is, I have to acknowledge, a difficult issue that we have resolved as far as rural broadband is concerned, but it is difficult in towns and cities where state aid is deemed to distort free markets, and also because these are areas where we see a high level of commercial investment. It may be, however, that the commercial investment case is not as clear as we believe, but we should make every effort to support that commercial investment before investing in state funding. The criteria for public investment is that the area must not have current or indeed planned supply of services within 3 years, and we have to test that through market reviews such as the open market review that my honourable friend referred to in his remarks. This does take time, it does take a lot of planning, and it does take a lot of resourcing. And in places like Cheltenham and many other similar towns, the case for public investment is therefore not straightforward, and we have to tread carefully. The Fastershire project, for example, ran a market review in 2011, and areas that were reported to be without provision or with plans for it were included within the scope for investment under phase 1 of the programme. The belief at the time would have been that many areas outside the scope of the local programme will be covered by commercial plans. However, sometimes plans do change for unforeseen reasons, and there will be another opportunity under the current open market review of phase 2 of the programme to consider including those areas in the local plans.
Giving me a second time. One of the problems with the initial open market review process appears to have been this basis on which information was exchanged about which areas were commercial and which weren't, in that the open market review was conducted on a postcode basis, whereas actual delivery has been cabinet by cabinet or street by street or premises by premises. So there have been gaps that have emerged within postcodes where Fastershire say they can't do it because that postcode was deemed to be commercially viable, but nevertheless people within that postcode are being told by BT that it's not commercially viable. Could he knock heads together and try and get these kind of issues resolved?
There are many local issues to consider. The viability of enabling some cabinets and indeed including some premises is not straightforward. We do go down to 6- and 7-digit postcodes, but I am happy to look at any specific examples that he wishes to bring before me. Other factors that come into play are local infrastructure, buildings, the locations of cabinets, planning permissions, railway lines, street furniture. All of these can cause problems. And where suppliers can't connect these cabinets due to these obstacles, we work closely with them to provide solutions. And as I say, the open market review in Herefordshire and Gloucestershire should resolve some of these issues. But again, if he has specific examples that he would like us to look at, I would be only too delighted to do so. I have to also say, while I'm talking about the Fastershire project in Herefordshire and Gloucestershire, that this is also an area where there are a number of technologies and a number of providers offering a different range of solutions. So companies like Loop, Scorpio, Airband and Cotswold Wireless Network are all providing services in different parts of the two counties. And also, as the Honourable Member knows, we have announced 8 pilot projects with alternative providers to look at getting to the most hard-to-reach areas. Another important issue the Honourable Member raised was the provision around new builds, and I have to say that this is a frustration that I share with him. We did look at regulation in 2010, and it was decided at the time that regulation would not be appropriate. But it has become quite clear in the last few months that there were a number of large developments that were being constructed without proper provision for broadband. Now, it is possible for local councils to stipulate, to make it clear when they give planning permission that they expect developers to provide superfast broadband. But by engaging with BT and with Virgin and with a number of other providers such as Hyperoptic, it became clear that we needed a much better system of developers working together with these organisations. So we have now instituted, as it were, a forum following 2 meetings with me as the Minister, but also a series of meetings with BDUK, a forum whereby developers can contact telecoms providers with their plans for new builds so that superfast broadband can be provided at the appropriate time in order for ducts to be laid and so on before proper building commences. I'm also very pleased indeed that a company like Openreach, for example, has now hired an additional 1,500 engineers, or is in the process of hiring an additional 1,500 engineers in order to meet this kind of demand. So we will work with house builders and telecoms providers to continue to develop an action plan to ensure that new developments do have access to superfast broadband, because I agree wholeheartedly with the Honourable Member that it is completely unacceptable in this day and age for somebody to move into a new home and not to find that they have superfast broadband ready to be connected. Mr Hollowbone, forgive me for reading a significant proportion of this speech. I will now go into improvisation mode. I'll try to avoid hesitation, repetition or indeed deviation by summing up that the Fastershire project has, I think, been so far a great success. 32,000 premises covered out of a total of almost 150,000 planned, something like £50 million being invested. The problems highlighted by my honourable friend in his excellent speech without notes are problems with which I am familiar, and they are problems to do, frankly, with urban development. It is difficult to get appropriate state aid in order for us to subsidise broadband rollout in urban areas. People find it hard to believe, but there are urban areas which some telecoms companies believe are not economical to provide. But I will certainly take any specific examples he wishes to give me, and I will do as he has instructed Mr Hollowbone, which is to knock heads together, I must stress in the metaphorical sense, and see if we can make some progress.
Order. I suspend the sitting until 2:30 this afternoon. Order, order.
Grand Committee Room ident. Grand Committee Room ident.